Okay, so this is the short summary on William Shakespeare. Who was William Shakespeare? William Shakespeare is by far the most famous playwright ever seen in the history of mankind. I mean, Shakespeare. He has made so much impact in the English language. He's created many synonyms, idioms throughout the English language. He's performed. Sorry, he has written many plays, such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Romeo and Juliet. In total, he has penned 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and if I'm just looking over here, I'm just looking at my notes, making sure I have everything spot on, and several narrative poems. He passed away in 1616, leaving behind a body of work, which is very true. And I remember he married a wife which was 8 years older than him, which is a bit mad. But he he likely wrote Midsummer Night's Dream for many reasons. However, we are going to go straight into Shakespeare's Globe. William Shakespeare is known for Shakespeare's Globe. It is the most famous landmark theatre-wise in all of London because of its historical value. So, the theatre company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, originally performed at the theatre in Shoreditch. That was where they originally performed. However, over the freezing winter break, they dismantled the entire framework of the old playhouse, snuck beams across the River Thames, and used them to build the original Globe on the South Bank. Shakespeare was part owner, owning 10%. He was earning bread from that. And that was the first Shakespeare's Globe. However, during the fire of 1613, during a performance of Henry VIII, a theatrical cannon misfired, igniting the theatre's wooden beams, and the whole theatre erupted in flames. Miraculously, the entire building burnt down to the ground in under 2 hours without a single casualty, thankfully. Through the man's burning breeches reported to have been burnt out bottle of ale. The rebuild, though, so after it got burnt down, it actually got rebuilt. So the rebuild with a tiled roof in 1614, but was later pulled down by the Puritans in 1644 when the theatrical performances were banned. So furthermore, to further emphasize on the layout of Shakespeare's Globe, the layout was dubbed the Wooden O by Shakespeare and Henry V. It was an open-air, 20-sided polygon. The stage projected into the central yard surrounding by three tiers of converted galleries. It held up to 3,000 spectators, which for at the time was so many. 3,000 back then was so much. It cost a lot of money as well. And, well, it created a massive sound of energy with no artificial lighting plays. The plays were always performed in daylight. They were always performed in daylight. Shakespeare loved using natural light in his performances, which I believe to this day is something we do not use enough. I think that is incredible, using natural lighting. And the social divide. So, a massive thing about the era Shakespeare was brought up in is that there was a massive class system. The upper were upper, the lower, the middle were middle. And a lot of the time, in that 3,000 capacity, they were actually split between class. So the upper class would sit at the very top, and they had the best view. The middle class in the middle, and the bottom row, the bottom class. And plus, they all had different price tickets. And as well, the bottom class had the worst view, and the upper class had the best view. And it further shows a real dramatic change in society nowadays, because nowadays, that would not be an issue at all. You just got to pay a certain price, and bang, you got a ticket. Back then, it was always depending on class. There was always tickets for each of the three classes, but there was only certain amounts. So a poorer person could not go for an upper class ticket, and upper class could not go for a lower class ticket. They were always separated via booth as well. And even with performance interactions, a lot of the time when performances were being held, they would always make it so that the upper class had the best view and that the lower class had the worst view, which was a real trick that Shakespeare has done. However, that is something we will talk about later, the sheer class in Tudor to society, because Tudor England was quite the journey. Anyway, the modern rebirth. So in 1997, Shakespeare's Globe was firmly rebuilt and was actually recreated in central London, which we can go see now, and it is built in the exact same way it was built. It was even built Tudor-wise, it looks Tudor-wise, and it still holds 3,000 people, and it is built in the complete same way that it was before. And why did Shakespeare write A Midsummer Night's Dream? I bet we're all likely wondering. So, written around 1959 or 1956, so he was about 30 years old when he wrote it. He was about 31 when he wrote Midsummer Night's Dream. Midsummer's really stands out because it's one of the few plays that Shakespeare wrote that doesn't heavily rely on a single or direct liberty source for his plot. Instead, he wove together its several public, cultural, artistic, and practitioner motivations, which is very true because there's three things in Midsummer's Night's Dream. There's not one plot. There's three different plots. There's the mechanicals, there's the fairies, and there's the lovers. There's three things happening at the same time. A big historical theory as well about MidSummers, and I'm getting this via research by the way, is that it was commissioned, he wrote the play as a special entertainment as an elite real word Elizabethan wedding. So he originally wrote the play to be performed at an Elizabethan wedding, which is honestly crazy. And something different about MidSummers towards the end is that because the finishing is Oberon, Puck, and Titania, they all cast a spell on the audience, which is one of the few times where there's actually a break in the fourth wall in a Shakespeare production, which is crazy because then during the Shakespearean era, the fourth wall was one of the strongest aspects, and in this situation, it's been broken by the actors, and it's also to cast a little spell on them as a bit of fun because it makes the audience more involved in it. Shakespeare furthermore wrote the play MidSummers from a purely creative standpoint. Shakespeare wrote the play to explore and satirize his own craft by including the mechanicals, the working class amateur actors led by Nick Bottom. He pokes affectionate, fun and amateur theatre troupes of London, the play within a play pyramid in Thisbe. It allowed Shakespeare to act it allowed Shakespeare to laugh at bad acting, melodramatic writing, and sheer absurdity of stage illusions, which is true, because Shakespeare really does show the caste system in MidSummers. The mechanicals are the lower working class, the lovers are the upper class, despite Helena, and Hermia and and then there's the fairies, and the fairies they're not in either. They're really not in either. The fairies are like their own world. But Shakespeare does really show the caste system that MidSummers does have. And we can see it towards the end in the finishing scene where where the mechanicals enter Theseus's palace and the lovers and the royalty of Theseus and Hippolyta treat them awfully. Furthermore, according to research, there is the MidSummers context. In Elizabethan culture, Shakespeare, he was about Elizabethan, Tudor Elizabethan. In Elizabethan culture, Midsummer's Eve, which was June 23rd, was traditionally associated with magic, including festival-induced madness and the thinning of veil between the human and spirit worlds, the perfect thematic backdrop for a chaotic story about losing yourself in the woods. That in itself is a big reason why Shakespeare wrote MidSummers, to give a visual representation of the midsummer context, which was a big thing in the Elizabethan era. And so Shakespeare thought it was a good way to sell a few tickets by making it into a visual representation as well as into a reality.